Clarice had always believed in the quiet power of consistency. At 49, she had spent over a decade, 13 years to be exact, devoting herself wholly to Northwell Logistics, a mid-sized but rapidly evolving company tucked away in Eugene, Oregon. When she first walked into the office, the IT systems were a tangled mess of legacy tools, loosely connected servers, and duct tape solutions that barely held up during peak operations. But Clarice saw not a mess, but potential, a challenge she could mold into stability. With meticulous care and an almost maternal attention to detail, she began rebuilding the company's digital infrastructure piece by piece, line by line, module by module. In those early years, she stayed late in the office, not because anyone asked her to, but because she felt responsible. She knew what it meant to build something from the ground up. Clarice wasn't just maintaining systems, she was laying down a digital nervous system that would carry the weight of logistics, supply chains, and client trust. Over time, her efforts evolved into a foundation so robust that even during crises, cyber attacks, outages, or frantic seasonal surges, the system never buckled. It stood firm, like she did. Her role wasn't glamorous. No spotlight ever pointed her way. In board meetings, executives spoke of growth and margins, rarely acknowledging the silent framework that supported every deal. But Clarice never needed applause. Her fulfillment came from knowing that her work mattered, that without the architecture she designed and safeguarded, the business wouldn't run for even a day. She understood every database heartbeat, every firewall rule, every vulnerability patched at 2 a.m. without a soul noticing. And she did it, not just with skill, but with love. There were moments when she wondered if anyone truly saw the depth of her commitment. When younger hires breezed through with big ideas and polished pitches, she sometimes felt like the foundation no one praised, reliable, invisible, and taken for granted. But even in those moments, Clarice held her head high. Because she knew who she was. She was the one who made things work when they broke. She was the one who thought 3 steps ahead so others didn't have to panic. She didn't just build systems, she built trust, quietly, relentlessly, every single day. Now, as she approached her 50s, Clarice found herself reflecting more often. Not with bitterness, but with a deep, calm pride. The work of her hands and her mind had kept the company running for over a decade. Her fingerprints were on every router configuration, every single sign-on workflow, every encrypted tunnel that kept company secrets safe. Northwell might not wear her name, but its bones, its digital DNA, were hers. And that, to her, meant everything. The shift came not with a storm, but with a polished smile and a PowerPoint deck. Marina Carver, the new CTO, arrived with fresh energy, buzzwords that dazzled, and a vision to modernize. Alongside her was Elliot Navarro, a consultant whose confidence filled every room he entered. Within weeks, the two presented a bold proposal to the board. A complete overhaul of Northwell Logistics' internal systems, a migration to a cloud-native architecture that they claimed would future-proof the company and align it with the latest tech trends. The board, impressed by the sleek vision and the promise of scalability, cost efficiency, and modernization, voted unanimously to proceed. Clarice watched the announcement from her usual seat at the edge of the table, a quiet tension pressing against her ribs. She had built the current system with her own hands. Every module, every line of logic, every integration point had her fingerprints. It wasn't flashy, but it was resilient, proven, battle-tested, stable. It had withstood threats, adapted to growth, and delivered results. But now, with a few words on a slide and a consultant's pitch, all of that was deemed legacy. Obsolete. Her life's work was being reduced to a list of components to be dismantled and rewritten. They didn't even offer her a role in the new architecture. Instead, she was asked, no, instructed, to begin knowledge transfer. Her mission was now to document every aspect of the systems she had created so that others could tear them apart. Clarice was not naive. She knew what this meant. She was being phased out, professionally and quietly, wrapped in polite language and HR-approved phrasing. The dignity of her work would be archived, not honored. At first, she moved mechanically. Notes, diagrams, tutorials. She walked Elliot through processes he barely pretended to understand, nodding with a smile that never reached his eyes. Clarice noticed the way he skimmed her documentation, the way he treated her insights like checklist items. He didn't see the soul in the system, the thousand small decisions, trade-offs, and protections she had woven in over the years. He saw only a structure to be replaced. But beneath the routine, Clarice carried a quiet ache. It wasn't just the end of a job, it felt like the end of a relationship. For 13 years, the system had been her silent companion, her triumph, her labor of love. To see it stripped down, without reverence, hurt more than she expected. There were moments late at night when she lingered in the server room longer than necessary, touching the machines like saying goodbye to old friends. Still, she did her job. She documented thoroughly. She answered questions. She kept her professionalism intact. But inside, something was breaking. Something no resignation letter or retirement party could capture. It wasn't just a system they were replacing. It was her legacy, her voice in the walls. And no one seemed to notice it was disappearing. Clarice had always believed that dedication spoke for itself, that loyalty, competence, and the quiet discipline of showing up, day after day, would be enough to earn respect. But in the past few weeks, that belief had begun to crumble. The more she watched Elliot Navarro breeze through the corridors of Northwell, the more she felt something inside her twisting, not just hurt, but betrayal. It wasn't just that they were replacing her system, it was the way they were doing it. As if it had never mattered, as if she had never mattered. Elliot was everything Clarice was not. Flashy, articulate, confident to the point of arrogance. He spoke in buzzwords that dazzled the board. Serverless, horizontal scaling, Kubernetes native, and zero-trust architecture. To them, he was a visionary. But to Clarice, it was clear. He had only skimmed the surface. He could speak the language, yes, but without understanding its weight. He dismissed the current infrastructure with offhanded comments. "It's amazing this old thing even held together this long." Or, "We'll have to rip out most of this legacy code. It's too brittle to salvage." Legacy. The word stung like a slur. Her system wasn't just code. It was a living, breathing organism that had grown and adapted over 13 years of real-world challenges. It had survived recessions, cyber attacks, unexpected growth spurts, and it had done so with grace. With her. But now, her work was being dismantled in front of her, and the person leading the charge didn't even have the decency to ask how it worked before judging it. Every line of condescension Elliot uttered, every time Marina nodded in agreement, felt like another small betrayal. And what burned the most was not just their dismissal of the system, but the erasure of the years of sacrifice behind it. The long nights, the canceled vacations, the weekends she stayed behind while others went home. All of it was being rendered invisible in the face of a newer, shinier vision. She hadn't expected applause or awards. Clarice was never one for public recognition. But this quiet sidelining, this rewriting of history, where she was just a name on an outdated flowchart, was too much. She had given the best years of her professional life to Northwell, and now it felt like she was being told it had all been a mistake. A necessary evil before the real innovation could begin. There were days when she'd catch herself staring blankly at the screen, the documentation cursor blinking like a metronome of goodbye. She felt like a relic in her own office, like a ghost walking through code she knew better than her own home. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was insidious, creeping into her thoughts late at night when the lights were off and the silence was loud. She had once believed she was building something that would last, but now she wasn't so sure anyone had ever really seen her. There was one thing in the system Clarice held closer than anything else, a core encryption library she had built from the ground up during the early, chaotic years of Northwell's tech evolution. She called it Parker Crypt, a name inspired by her late father, a quiet man who had taught her to think in layers, to always build strong foundations. Parker Crypt wasn't just a tool, it was the heart of the system's security architecture. It safeguarded sensitive data, protected user credentials, encrypted transactional pipelines, and ensured end-to-end integrity. Without it, the system wouldn't just wobble, it would fall apart. And yet, what most of the board didn't know, and what Elliot hadn't bothered to ask, was this. Parker Crypt wasn't company property. It was hers. Clarice had created it on her own time, years ago, long before Northwell had a coherent tech policy or any real documentation around proprietary code. She'd maintained it separately, licensed it under strict terms, and though she had allowed Northwell to use it, out of loyalty, not obligation, she had never signed over ownership. There was no ambiguity in the logs, no loophole to exploit. It was hers, legally and ethically, a rare piece of software that belonged to her, and her alone. And it just so happened that the entire system now ran on it. Only Clarice knew how it worked in depth, how to adapt it, how to patch it when vulnerabilities emerged, how to fine-tune its performance to meet evolving needs. It had grown with the system, becoming more elegant, more resilient with each version. And now, with the proposed overhaul, Clarice noticed something unsettling. Elliot had begun referencing encryption protocols and data handling designs that bore a suspicious resemblance to Parker Crypt's logic. He was drafting diagrams, outlining transition plans, and speaking in abstractions that mirrored the very system he barely understood. Yet not once had he acknowledged the library, nor asked about licensing, nor spoken her name. The disrespect cut deep. This wasn't just code. This was Clarice's craftsmanship, the distilled product of thousands of quiet hours and decades of experience. Parker Crypt had been her answer to mediocrity, a precise, robust, elegant piece of work that had never failed. Now it was being eyed like a piece of salvage from a wreckage they hadn't even taken the time to understand. Clarice felt the tension rising. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was about boundaries, about protecting the one thing no one else had built. If they wanted to replace her, they could try. But Parker Crypt wouldn't go with them unless she allowed it. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something stirring in her chest. Not grief, not loss, but strength. Quiet, steady strength. She still held something that mattered, and she would decide what came next. Clarice had always played fair. Even in the face of quiet dismissal, she carried herself with dignity. She didn't sabotage. She didn't speak poorly of Marina or Elliot, not even in private. But there is a difference between destroying and withholding, and Clarice understood that difference with a clarity sharpened by years of being underestimated. So when the time came to begin the handover process, she made a decision, not out of spite, but out of quiet strategy. She would not hand over everything. Parker Crypt was too important, too precise, too vulnerable in the wrong hands. It wasn't just a library. It was an intricate web of encryption logic layered with defensive programming patterns and custom algorithms she'd written and rewritten over the years. There were no user manuals, because there was never supposed to be. She was the manual. She was the failsafe. And now, she could see how little the new regime appreciated that. Elliot came to her desk with polite urgency, asking for comprehensive documentation on the encryption layer. Clarice nodded and handed over what looked complete, but wasn't. The documents she prepared were clean, thorough in appearance, laced with technical detail. But the core integration principles, the subtle dependencies, the behavioral nuances of Parker Crypt's key negotiation methods, those she omitted, carefully and deliberately. Not out of malice, but preservation. What she gave them was enough to look convincing, enough to satisfy a review, but not enough to replicate. At night, when the office emptied and the building grew still, Clarice stayed behind, compiling her own version of the truth. She created a private archive, a full backup of Parker Crypt, annotated with years of thoughts, improvements, future ideas. She copied her private notes to an encrypted drive, labeled not with code, but with a name only she would recognize. It was preparation, not rebellion. She wasn't trying to wage war. She was preparing to walk away without leaving everything behind. The duplicity weighed on her, not in a guilty way, but in a sorrowful one. She didn't like being secretive. It wasn't her nature. But loyalty had to be mutual to survive. And what she'd witnessed over the past few months had proven otherwise. They wanted her knowledge, not her judgment. Her code, not her presence. Her silence, not her insight. So she gave them what they asked for, and quietly held back what they didn't know they needed. It was a strange sort of morning, packing up your life's work not in boxes, but in backup drives and layers of mental goodbye. As she zipped the final encrypted folder and tucked the hard drive into her worn leather bag, Clarice paused and looked around her office one last time. Everything still appeared intact, but something invisible had shifted. She wasn't just preparing to leave. She was reclaiming what was hers. The email arrived on a Wednesday morning. Plain subject line, sterile wording. Transition update. Final notification. Clarice stared at it for a moment before opening it, though she already knew what it would say. Her hand hovered over the mouse, but her heart was still. No dramatic reaction, just the quiet weight of confirmation. Inside was a formal letter from HR, wrapped in corporate pleasantries. It praised her long-standing contributions, cited strategic restructuring, and offered a modest severance package. 30 days pay, continuation of benefits for 2 months, and a final condition, a non-disparagement clause. A polite muzzle tied with a legal bow. There was no mention of Parker Crypt, no mention of ownership, licensing, or the foundational role it played in the architecture they were now so eager to replace. Perhaps they had forgotten, or perhaps they simply never knew. Maybe Elliot assumed it was company property, a relic folded into their domain like every other piece of code. It was laughable, really, how casually they brushed aside the most essential part of the system, unaware of the quiet leverage Clarice still held. But in that moment, laughter was far from her. What she felt was more complex: grief, pride, and something oddly liberating. She read the letter again. This wasn't just a layoff, it was an erasure. No thank you meeting, no farewell gathering, no personal note from Marina. After 13 years, Clarice was being removed like a line item, cost optimization masked as transformation. And the way they did it, so carefully dressed in HR jargon, was almost crueler than open conflict. It allowed no space for anger, no space for closure. Just clean, bureaucratic dismissal. She signed the documents slowly, methodically. She didn't fight the severance. It wasn't worth the energy. They wanted silence, and she was happy to give them silence. But silence didn't mean surrender. Clarice had already backed up everything she needed. The core of Parker Crypt sat safely offline, inaccessible to anyone but her. No fingerprints, no access, just a quiet pulse, waiting. And while they hadn't asked about the licensing, she wasn't about to volunteer that information. She owed them nothing more. Later that day, as she packed up the last few items from her office, her father's old fountain pen, the small jade figurine from a conference in Kyoto, a yellowing printout of her first system diagram, she took a final look around. The walls were bare, the bookshelves empty. The system she had built still lived on the servers for now. But its soul, its heart, Parker Crypt, was hers. Untouched, unclaimed. Outside, it was raining lightly. She zipped up her coat and walked out without a word. No one stopped her. No one noticed. But as the door closed behind her, she felt no bitterness, only clarity. They had let her go. But they had no idea what they had let go of. Clarice didn't rush to act. She didn't speak up immediately, didn't send an email or make a phone call. Instead, she chose silence. A deliberate, calculated silence. It was a silence that would stretch over the coming weeks, even months, as she quietly watched the company she had built from the ground up struggle with the gaps she knew would inevitably appear. It was a rare kind of power, one that didn't shout, but instead waited. Clarice wasn't going to chase down what she had lost. She wasn't going to protest or demand acknowledgement. She had given enough of herself to this company. She had poured years into its growth, its stability, and now it was time to let them grapple with the consequences of their oversight. Parker Crypt wasn't just a tool to her, it was her legacy. The company didn't understand it fully, nor did they see the complexities and nuances that lay within it. Elliot might have been confident in his cloud-native vision, Marina might have brushed it off as legacy code, but neither of them had the faintest idea of what they were about to lose. They hadn't asked about it, hadn't bothered to fully understand it. And now, Clarice was watching them unknowingly step into a vacuum of their own making. Without her expertise, without her knowledge of how to integrate it or adapt it when things went wrong, the system would begin to show its cracks. It was only a matter of time. Clarice knew this, and it wasn't out of malice that she stood back. It wasn't revenge. It was simply a recognition of how deeply interconnected everything was, how fragile their reliance on her had been. They had assumed the systems she had built would be just like any other, a plug-and-play replacement. But it didn't work that way. Not with something as bespoke and intricate as Parker Crypt. The gaps would emerge, errors would pile up, and eventually, they would turn to her for answers they could no longer easily access. She walked away from Northwell, but she didn't leave empty-handed. She took with her the one thing they couldn't take from her: the knowledge, the ownership, the quiet confidence that, no matter what happened next, she had retained control. She wasn't just a former employee. She was the architect of the very system they were now struggling to replace. And that was a power that no restructuring could strip away. It was a power that remained, tucked away in her files, her mind, her heart. Clarice smiled slightly to herself as she drove home that evening, the rain still falling softly outside. The silence wasn't final. It was just a pause. The next move would come when they least expected it, when the systems began to break, and they had no choice but to turn to the one person who truly understood how it all worked. Until then, she was content to wait. In the end, they would have to come to her, not the other way around. After 13 long years of dedication, growth, and countless memories, Clarice finally bid farewell to Northwell, the place that had become her second home. It wasn't a grand departure marked by speeches or formal goodbyes, but rather a quiet, intimate gathering in the break room. There, surrounded by a few close colleagues, she accepted hugs, shared laughter, and held back tears. The walls that had witnessed her professional journey, from ambitious newcomer to seasoned expert, now echoed with gentle words of appreciation and warmth. It was a modest farewell, but sincere. Marina, the CTO, made a brief appearance. She had always been reserved, not one for drawn-out sentiments, but her presence, however fleeting, held meaning. A quick smile, a few words of acknowledgement, and then she was gone. Clarice appreciated the gesture. It wasn't grand, but it was real. And in that moment, Clarice felt a deep sense of closure. Leaving Northwell wasn't a decision she took lightly. 13 years had woven her life tightly into its fabric. Early morning commutes, late nights fixing systems, mentoring juniors, weathering company restructures, celebrating product launches. Each moment had shaped her, challenged her, and helped her discover not just the professional she was, but the person she had become. But there comes a time when even the most familiar paths start to feel too narrow. For Clarice, that time had come. The first morning after she left was strange, quiet, unhurried, and startlingly free. There were no meetings on her calendar, no emails demanding attention, no fires to put out. For the first time in over a decade, she had no professional obligations. Instead, she found herself lingering over breakfast, walking aimlessly through the park, breathing in the stillness that her previous pace had rarely allowed. It was a calm she hadn't known she needed. She reconnected with old friends, some of whom she hadn't seen in years. Coffee dates turned into long conversations, laughter, and reflection. She caught up on books that had gathered dust on her shelves, picked up painting again, a hobby she had long set aside, and even took a short solo trip to the coast, where she watched the sun dip below the horizon in a moment of pure solitude. People often asked her if she was planning to jump into a new job. But Clarice, ever thoughtful, simply smiled and shook her head. Financially stable and emotionally grounded, she had the rare luxury of pausing, of listening to herself. She wasn't in a rush. There would be other companies, other roles. But for now, she was learning to embrace the space between endings and beginnings, to honor the chapter that had closed and wait, patiently, for the next one to unfold. 2 months had passed since Clarice stepped away from Northwell. Life had found a gentler rhythm. Her days were filled with stillness, self-reflection, and moments of quiet joy. But then, the messages began. At first, they were friendly check-ins from former colleagues. "Hope you're enjoying your time off. We miss you around here." But gradually, the tone shifted. Subtle at first. "Quick question about the security architecture you built." Then more urgent. "Do you remember how the fallback auth protocol was configured?" Soon, the inquiries turned into full-blown distress signals. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. The new system, hastily deployed after her departure, was failing catastrophically. User authentication was broken. Employees couldn't access their accounts. Multi-factor authentication bypasses were failing. And worse, sensitive data had begun leaking. Logs meant to track these breaches were either incomplete or entirely blank. The audit trails, the backbone of compliance and accountability, were a mess. Clarice, reading the messages, felt a chill settle over her. Then came Marina, not in person, not directly. She never reached out herself, but Clarice could read between the lines. Others mentioned her, how she was demanding answers, holding tense meetings, trying to trace the fault lines back to someone. Elliot, Clarice's successor, who had once been so confident and eager to take the reins, had all but vanished. His Slack was silent, his phone disconnected. He had folded under the pressure, leaving a vacuum in leadership and technical knowledge. Then, one evening, her phone rang. James. She hadn't spoken to him since the farewell. He'd always been steady, dependable, someone who had quietly held the company together behind the scenes. But now, his voice was tight with urgency. "Clarice," he said, "we're in trouble. It's bad, really bad." He didn't elaborate much. He didn't need to. Clarice could hear it in his voice. The weariness, the fear, and beneath it, a quiet plea. "We need you," he said finally. "Not officially, not yet. But you're the only one who knows how it was supposed to work. The only one we trust." Clarice was silent. She felt the weight of it, not just the technical disaster, but the emotional pull. This wasn't her mess. She had left everything in order. But still, the system bore her fingerprints. The company, the people. They had been her world for 13 years. She had built those walls, guarded those doors. Now they were crumbling. She stared at her phone long after the call ended, heart heavy with conflict. She had found peace, distance, space to breathe. And yet, part of her was already stepping back toward the fire, toward the place she once called home. Clarice knew better than to act on emotion. When James called, her heart stirred with old loyalties, but her mind remained clear. Northwell was no longer her responsibility, and more importantly, she had learned, perhaps the hard way, the importance of boundaries. So when Marina's name began flashing on her screen, once, twice, then repeatedly, Clarice chose silence. She didn't pick up. She didn't reply. Instead, she called Catherine. Catherine was more than just a lawyer. She was a sharp strategist and an unwavering advocate. Clarice had consulted her before leaving Northwell, ensuring everything about her departure, the transfer of access, the handover of tools, the end of licensing agreements, was airtight. Now, as Northwell began fumbling with a crumbling system built on tools they no longer had the right to use, Clarice knew she needed Catherine more than ever. "They're still using Parker Crypt," Clarice said, calm but firm. Parker Crypt was a custom encryption module Clarice had built during her time at Northwell, robust, elegant, and tightly integrated. It had been under a personal licensing agreement, one that had expired when she left. Catherine didn't hesitate. "They have no legal right to use it anymore, especially not in production." Her voice was cool and composed. "Let's set up a meeting." What followed was a tense, high-stakes negotiation. The virtual conference room was stiff with formality. Marina sat stone-faced on the screen, flanked by Northwell's legal counsel and two senior engineers who looked visibly uncomfortable. Clarice, composed and professional, kept her camera off. She let Catherine do the talking. It was Catherine who laid everything out: the expiration of the licensing agreement, the clear documentation of the handover process, the cease and desist letter ready to be filed if needed. Every legal detail was accounted for, every document time-stamped and watermarked. Catherine's tone never wavered, courteous but unflinching. Marina, used to commanding rooms, struggled to find footing. She pressed, she implied, even tried to guilt-trip, mentioning Clarice's long years of service, the relationships, the sense of duty. But Catherine met every attempt with steady resistance. "This isn't about loyalty," she said firmly. "It's about the law." Clarice watched, silent but resolute. This wasn't revenge. This was respect, for her work, for her boundaries, for the professional line she had drawn. Northwell had assumed she would come back when things fell apart, but Clarice was no longer the woman who sacrificed herself to keep systems running. She had walked away with dignity, and now she was protecting the integrity of that decision. When the meeting ended, Northwell had no choice but to comply. They would have to disable Parker Crypt and rebuild without it. It would take time, and it would cost them, but the message was clear. Clarice was not their safety net anymore. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and felt a quiet strength settle in her chest. She had chosen the high road, not out of vengeance, but out of self-respect. After the tense negotiations, Clarice knew the ball was in her court. Northwell was desperate, not just for a quick fix, but for someone who truly understood the inner workings of their fragile infrastructure. And that someone was her. But this time, she wouldn't return as the loyal employee who once carried the weight of the company on her back, without question. If she was going to step back into the chaos, it would be on her terms. Through Catherine, she outlined her conditions. They weren't suggestions, they were requirements, built from hard-earned experience and self-respect. First, a 6-month consulting contract, temporary, clearly defined, and protected by legal boundaries. Second, her compensation, 3 times her former salary. It wasn't just about money, it was a statement, a recognition of the expertise and trust Northwell had undervalued until it was nearly too late. Third, and most crucially, she demanded public acknowledgement of her contributions to the system's architecture. For years, her work had formed the backbone of Northwell's digital infrastructure, yet much of it had remained in the shadows, passed off as team efforts or buried in generic reports. That was no longer acceptable. Her work would be named, credited, and recognized, both internally and externally. And finally, she insisted on retaining ownership of the custom software she had developed, particularly Parker Crypt. While she was willing to license it again for the duration of her consulting work, she made it clear: the intellectual property was hers, and this time, the credit would follow. To Clarice's quiet satisfaction, Northwell agreed to nearly all her terms. There were minor revisions and a few legal footnotes, but the message was clear. They needed her, and they were willing to honor what she brought to the table. When Clarice returned to the company, virtually of course, it was with a very different presence. She wasn't rejoining the team as a subordinate or a faceless name on a long email thread. She logged in as Clarice M., independent security architect and lead consultant. Her Slack handle carried a badge. Her email signature was unmistakable. And in meetings, people listened. The tone had changed. The hesitation, the politics, the hierarchy, they no longer applied to her. It was strange at first to walk familiar halls with new authority. Some colleagues greeted her with genuine warmth, others with cautious deference. Marina kept her interactions brief and professional, but Clarice didn't return for approval or redemption. She came back to fix what was broken, not just in code, but in culture. She was no longer someone trying to prove her worth. Clarice approached the crisis with calm precision. She didn't need time to familiarize herself with the system. She had designed it. She knew Parker Crypt inside and out, its architecture, its logic, its delicate interdependencies. What had taken the new team months to dismantle and rebuild incorrectly, she unraveled in days. Not through brute force, but through insight, experience, and deep understanding. One by one, she identified the vulnerabilities, the authentication errors, the broken encryption flows, the dysfunctional audit logs, all symptoms of a system misunderstood and misused. Clarice methodically patched the damage, rewrote key modules, and reconfigured security protocols. She restored the core integrity of the infrastructure with quiet efficiency, while the internal teams watched in a mixture of awe and embarrassment. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic fix-deployed headline, just stability. Logins worked again. Data leaks stopped. The audit logs began recording correctly. It was as if the chaos had never happened, but everyone knew better. Behind the calm surface was the unmistakable signature of Clarice's work. As her solutions took hold, something unexpected followed: recognition. People began talking, not just engineers, but senior management. The once discredited architecture she had built was now seen for what it truly was: robust, forward-thinking, and ahead of its time. Reports circulated acknowledging that the fault hadn't been in the system itself, but in the reckless attempt to replace it without understanding its foundation. Her earlier contributions, long overlooked or taken for granted, were now being cited in presentations and technical memos. Meanwhile, Elliot had vanished. After the collapse of the modernization project he led, there were no explanations, no parting notes, just silence. His disappearance symbolized more than personal failure. It marked the end of a misguided attempt to rewrite a system without honoring the knowledge it was built on. The ambitious modernization initiative was officially shelved, and the company pivoted back to Clarice's original framework, now fully restored. When her 6-month term neared its end, Clarice began handing over the reins. This time, she ensured everything was documented, every critical system mapped, every decision explained. She trained a small internal team, emphasizing not just how the systems worked, but why they worked that way. She wasn't just cleaning up a mess, she was passing on wisdom. And then she left. No farewell party this time, no cake in the break room, no awkward speeches, just a quiet, professional goodbye. But unlike before, she walked away with something immeasurably valuable: honor. Her reputation was not only intact, but elevated. She was no longer just a former employee. She was the architect who returned to save the system, the expert who couldn't be replaced. Clarice left Northwell not in the shadow of burnout or neglect, but in the clear light of earned respect. Her legacy was no longer silent. It spoke through every secure transaction, every encrypted log, every line of code that still bore her mark. Several months after Clarice wrapped up her consulting work with Northwell, life began to settle once more. She wasn't searching for anything, not another position, not recognition. She had proven herself, reclaimed her legacy, and earned the peace she now enjoyed. But one morning, an unexpected message lit up her inbox. It was from Jackson, the elusive founder of Northwell, long since moved on to new ventures. His message was warm, direct, and full of respect. "I've been following what happened," he wrote. "You turned a disaster into a legacy. I'm building something new, lean, ambitious, meaningful, and I want you to lead it. The offer: Chief Technology Officer of Cypress Ember, a startup focused on redefining data infrastructure for the healthcare sector. The vision was bold but grounded. And more importantly, Jackson wasn't offering just a title. He offered equity, influence, and the creative freedom to shape the technology from the ground up. Clarice considered it carefully. This wasn't about stepping back into chaos or repeating the past. It was a new canvas, with the benefit of experience. She said yes. As CTO, Clarice brought a clear philosophy to Cypress Ember. Use the right tools, not the loudest ones. In an industry obsessed with chasing trends, AI hype, blockchain fads, cloud-native buzzwords, she steered the team toward practical, secure, and scalable solutions. No shortcuts, no ego-driven architectures. Just clean, transparent, and maintainable systems that put safety and privacy first. She drew from lessons hard-won at Northwell, but didn't copy and paste. Instead, she reimagined the architecture from scratch, combining trusted core principles with modern but reliable tooling. She established rigorous standards, a culture of documentation, and a collaborative development environment. And this time, everything was credited properly. Every contributor was acknowledged. Every line of code, every framework decision was made in the open, intentional, considered. A year later, the Cypress Ember platform launched. Its reception was beyond what anyone expected. Hospitals, research institutions, and health data providers praised its simplicity, its security, its clarity. The platform was fast, elegant, and, most of all, trustworthy. The healthcare industry, often wary of new tech, embraced it not because it was flashy, but because it worked. In a move that surprised some, Clarice made the source code of Parker Crypt public. The core version, refined and hardened, was released as open source, a gift to the security community, but its advanced modules, tailored for high-security enterprise use, remained proprietary under Cypress Ember's wing. It was a perfect balance, contributing to the broader good while securing the company's competitive edge. Clarice had come full circle, not back where she started, but somewhere higher, clearer, and fully in command. No longer just a builder or a fixer, she had become a visionary, shaping not just systems, but the future of how technology could serve people with integrity.